Welcome to Ground Truth. Join Sam Faddis as he looks for truth from those on the ground, in the middle of the action with key insights regarding critical national and international issues. Listen for discussions and interviews on national security, terrorism, politics, espionage, the paranormal, and weapons of mass destruction.
Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ground Truth coming to you today from Keystone College, WKCV 103.5 FM. We're going to be talking about drug cartels, crisis on the other side of the border in Mexico, if that's the correct terminology. We have a great guest with us today. I think increasingly it appears to me that in the news media, whenever we're listening to somebody, these days we're listening to somebody whose forte is being provocative and throwing out buzzwords and providing no substance of any kind. So our guest today is sort of at the other end of the spectrum from that because he's all substance. He's a guy that I've known for some time. I'm going to say he has the distinction of being the tallest man ever to serve in a submarine in the U.S. Navy, but he tells me I'm going to get in trouble for saying that. Probably more to the point, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for counter-narcotics, a Navy vet, Iraq vet, Texas lawyer, all-around good guy, probably swell dancer as well, Richard Douglas. Richard, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Sam. It's terrific. I really appreciate the opportunity to come talk about the crisis on our side of the border. Can't separate from the one on the other side. So, ready when you are.
Yeah, well, you know, what we do, this whole show is about trying to provide some substance for people that are desperately searching for it, and I know you can help us out with that. So, when I first reached out to you about coming on the show a week, 2 weeks ago, it was in the aftermath of the, I'll call it, massacre of a number of American citizens, Mormons living in Mexico, killed in broad daylight on Mexican soil by cartel members. And that really caught the attention of the American media, got a lot of press play up here. But without any disrespect intended to them or their loved ones, you know, that killing, as you well know, kind of more of business as usual in Mexico these days. I'm wondering if you can kind of paint a picture for us just to get us started, how bad things are in Mexico, the scope of the cartels, where we stand.
Sure, be happy to, Sam. Just two bio points first. I've actually lived in Mexico twice. I served there in the Foreign Service in the 1980s in Ciudad Juarez on the border across from El Paso, and I lived there as a private citizen doing some contract work for the Mexican Navy in Veracruz in 2011, 2012, 2013. And while in Veracruz, the situation there was so desperate because of infighting among the cartels that the state police was replaced by the Navy. And this was, of course, the Calderon administration. Unfortunately, there's been a big change in Mexico since then, which we can talk about. And just another little bio note is in the Pentagon, I had a terrific job. I was making sure that combatant commanders had all the resources they needed to carry out their counter-drug strategies all over the world, although primarily at that time it was Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Colombia. In my mind, it's impossible to separate the kinds of attacks that we saw that you've just mentioned from the financiers for the cartels who carry them out. And in my judgment, cartels' number one bankroll comes from American users. If you look at the statistics that are out there on bulk cash transfers, and I mean dollar bills on bales or in bags, each year from the United States to Mexico and Central America, it's in the tens of billions of dollars. And think about that. I mean, that's enough money in 1 year to pay for a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, maybe two. And unfortunately, in my mind, you know, our tendency is to point the finger at Mexico and Central America and say, why can't you guys get your act together? When in reality, I think leadership in our country ought to be, at the same time, pointing at our own people who use these narcotics and put that money directly into cartel coffers. And you want to see what happens with that money? Look what happened to the family down in Sonora, and look what happened when Chapo's son was taken into custody in Culiacan a few weeks ago, and there were 50 caliber machine guns mounted on trucks. That money went to pay for those weapons, and American users had their fingers on the trigger just as much as any cartel thug that you saw on the television.
Yeah, you made reference to this thing with Chapo's son, and that's another incident occurred a little bit before this shooting of these Mormons. And it also got some press play up here, but I'm not sure that people focused on it to the extent they needed to. I mean, here you had the Mexican government confronted in broad daylight by cartel forces that forced the Mexicans to surrender their prisoners. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of heavily armed guys forcing, in effect, the surrender of a Mexican government unit. I mean, they knew they went in force, the Mexicans did, understanding what they were doing, and still found themselves incapable of confronting these guys. Frankly, that troubled me tremendously. I mean, it wasn't necessarily that it was so unexpected. I didn't think it came out of left field. But it strikes me as one of those decisive moments. How does it strike you?
Well, absolutely. And it's also a good example of what's happened to the Mexican armed forces since the end of the Calderon administration and the beginning of the López Obrador administration. You know, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm no pushover on Mexico. I mean, I lived there twice. I understand the problems that there are in that country with corruption and so forth. But the influx of American drug dollars has astronomically aggravated the situation. And unfortunately, even under the best of circumstances, the historic relationship between the Mexican armed forces and the Mexican government is not like the one that we have here in the United States. And even with a president like Calderon, who respected the armed forces and tried to give the armed forces the resources it needed to Mexicans from these waves of murders and massacres, it wasn't enough for Calderon, and it's even less now under López Obrador, who is essentially starving the Mexican armed forces for resources. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm no ingenue about corruption in the police and the armed forces, but there are elements that we have worked with successfully in the past, and there are, people, judges, officers, prosecutors, you name it, in Mexican society who are just as eager as we are to see these kinds of things stopped. But they don't have the resources, and now with the current government in Mexico, they have even less. That's why I believe that we as Americans can make a huge difference in Mexico and Central America if we can get our drug appetite under control. And our leadership is doing not only Mexico and Central America, but our own nation a huge disservice by pretending that this is not even, you have a lot of counter-terrorism experience as a former Central Intelligence Agency officer. You understand the importance of finding the money, and the money flows into terrorist organizations. It's no different with the cartels. The difference is that the terrorist money is coming from, in many cases, the Middle East, private organizations, and individuals. The cartel terrorism, and that's what it is, that money is coming from American users. And that's a disgrace, and we should do something about it.
Well, it's interesting to me listening to you because it does strike me as a little ironic, doesn't it? We focused on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states a long time ago, certainly in a big way after 9/11, to some extent before then, because so much money was moving from there into the coffers of groups like Al-Qaeda. And I'm not suggesting by that I'm saying that Riyadh formally as a nation was doing that. But a lot of people with a lot of money were moving that cash. And I'm not going to say that it doesn't still happen, but the world has changed dramatically in that regard because we have a lot of focus on that. And we used to beat up on the Saudis and on the Emiratis and so forth because they wouldn't cut off this money flow to Al-Qaeda. And what you're painting a picture of is basically that while we're beating up on them for that kind of thing, we're not doing much of anything to cut off the equivalent kind of flow straight out of our country into the coffers of drug cartels.
That's true. And, in the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, I think there were genuine good faith efforts to make a decision, mainly directed at money laundering. I mean, if you look at some of the first money laundering statutes from the early 1980s and the Cartagena summits, those statutes are still on the books. Every time you go into your bank and make a deposit over $10,000, there are reports and so forth. But the fact is, the money we're talking about is going back across the border in cash, in bales, and there is no accounting or accountability for any of that money. And one of the real problems we have here in the United States, in my judgment, is that we're not even tracking it as well as we should be. Until 2010, there was an organization up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, called the National Drug Intelligence Center. It was in the district of Representative John Murtha. You may remember him, a Vietnam veteran Marine who passed away in 2010. And that place was doing some tremendous analysis of flows of bulk cash transfers out of the U.S. every year. And their estimates were anywhere from $10, $15 to $29 billion per year. Well, when Representative Murtha passed away, NDIC shut down. And honestly don't think any U.S. government agency is doing the quality of analysis that we need and that they've done. And this, again, is another example, in my opinion, of the lack of leadership and the lack of urgency that we give to this problem. It's much easier to point the finger at the Mexican government and the corrupt police and public officials there than it is to look inward and try to understand one of the fundamental causes of chaos in Central America and Mexico. That is, those dollar bills being shipped down to those countries from American users.
Let me grab a hold of just one piece of that, Richard, because I find this fascinating. I've had some conversations with some other guys that I know on this issue in the past. You have to move drugs into the country in large quantities for a business on the scale we're talking about, and most Americans have some dim visibility. If they've seen something on television where, a semi-submersible watercraft has been intercepted or guys are caught crossing the border with something, drug mules, that kind of thing. We never have any visibility into is what you've mentioned several times now, which is the logistics of moving in bulk cash back across the border in Mexico. How does that happen? How physically does that happen?
There are any number of ways. You could use mules, essentially, to go in the other direction with smaller amounts. People hide cash in vehicles. The same kinds of false compartments that are used to bring heroin or cocaine or you name it into our country are used to take money out. There are coordinated efforts to essentially cross the border with large vehicles, small vehicles, vehicles of all kinds, even aircraft, with the hope that U.S. efforts to detect and interdict these cash shipments will fail. And the thing to remember is, if you're coming into the United States, let's say from Juarez or Laredo or one of the Mexican border cities, you got to sit online in your car for an hour and a half or so, or an hour to get to U.S. Customs. But when you're going the other direction, there's really no check. I mean, essentially, the only checkpoint you're going to see is once you cross the river and you're in Mexico. You cross the border and you're in Mexico. And customs in Mexico, I don't think, in my own experience at least, is anywhere near as thorough as U.S. Customs. So a lot of that money is going to slip through. But the same networks that bring drugs and people into our country are used to take bulk cash out. And I think you hit the nail on the head. We just don't generally understand that half of the equation unless there's a large bust. When they went into Chapo's house and found all his cash stashed away here and there, not all of it, probably not even a small part of it, but what you saw with Chapo is only a small piece of what actually goes. So I think that it's necessary to shine a much stronger light on that. So Americans really do understand that we have a part in that.
So I want to come back around here in a minute to talking some solutions so we don't spend all our time doing nothing but painting that dire picture. But I want to explore something just a little bit further before we move in that direction, which is the corruption, which you touched on. We talk about money. We talk about, we painted this picture of the drug cartels confronting the Mexican government in broad daylight and essentially forcing them to surrender their captives recently. And anybody who pays attention to news down in Mexico sees that the drug cartels now routinely have heavy weapons and armored vehicles and all kinds of things. But there's another piece to this which maybe is even more damaging, right? Which is the corruption, which is it's not just the capacity to confront the state, the nation state, in armed combat. It's the fact that you're eating away at the nation state. You're penetrating the state police, every institution in the country, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's a perfect example of where this money goes. Assume that you're on the receiving end in Central America or Mexico, and these bales and bags of money are coming in. Well, what do you do with it? Well, one thing you do with it is buy off judges, buy off police, buy off customs officials, the armed forces, you name it, in order to allow you to continue to do your illegal activity. And of course, the other place that most of these organizations spend their money is buying all kinds of firearms, heavy weapons. We've seen the 50 caliber. We know that belt-fed weapons are in the inventories, rifles, shotguns, you name it, and the kinds of vehicles that you would expect to see used by organizations such as this, fully armored vehicles, the most high technology communications gear, encrypted in order to defeat law enforcement, surveillance, you name it. All of that bought and paid for by the American user. So the corrosive effect on public authority in these countries, it's nothing new. I mean, look back to the 1970s when people like Pablo Escobar began their businesses with fairly low-level activity in marijuana, and then later Carlos Later and cocaine and so on. There's nothing new about the corrosive effect of American cash on public authority. I think what we've really seen more recently is the sophistication of technology that these organizations are now using. You mentioned semi-submersibles, which are basically small submarines that can transit from the Pacific coast of Colombia into the Pacific coast of Mexico and probably farther north if it weren't for the Coast Guard. High-tech communications, high-tech weapons, and I'm sure there are other things in the arsenal that we don't even know about.
So recently, we'll hopefully get some good ideas about what to do, but let me throw out one idea that I think is a bad one, but we'll get your thoughts. In the wake of this whole massacre of these Mormons, there was a whole series of prognosticators on television suggesting that maybe now that we should send the United States military into Mexico to confront the cartels directly. Thoughts?
Well, I think if we deploy our armed forces anywhere outside the United States, we have to ask ourselves, what can we do here at home to address this problem? And, this is not like the German invasion of Poland in 1939. This is not like anything that's happened in traditional warfare that we're aware of. This is something that we have the absolute duty and the absolute capacity to change and to control within our own borders. And I do believe that in a space of a year or two with serious political leadership, we could make a difference that would be seen in Mexico and Central America immediately, not only in the reduction of violence, but also the reduction of mass migrations and refugee flows, because these two problems are inextricably linked. The impact of the solid public authority and heavily armed terrorist organizations in the South is also mass migration. Now, coming back to, in my opinion, harebrained idea of sending troops into Mexico, we've done it twice. We did it in the 1840s. We did it in the early 1900s. If you want to know how it went in the 1840s, the best place to go is to read Ulysses Grant's autobiography. It's fascinating. Probably about a third of it is devoted to the Mexican War. And then, of course, the Pershing punitive expeditions in the early 1900s. I don't see any point. I think it's very easy for people who haven't had to do that sort of, who haven't actually defended their country in uniform like you, like me, to throw out these kinds of solutions. But I've lived in Mexico twice. The Mexicans will fight. They will protect their homeland. And if you want to create allies for the cartels, that's the best way to do it.
But two comments on that. First of all, I echo your thoughts, your comments about Grant's autobiography, and frankly, out of the whole thing, probably the part that fascinated me the most was his description of his time in the Mexican War, maybe because I knew less about his experiences there than about in the Civil War. My grandfather served with Pershing on the border, and he used to say that he was down there chasing Pancho Villa, and then he would always pause for effect and say, "You note that I said chasing, not catching." That was it. That was his. He spent a lot of time riding hither and yon to very, very little effect. Okay, so what should we do now? Money's the lifeblood, as we've laid out, for these cartels. So what do we do about this problem? How do we starve them?
Well, let me just, a parting thought. In my experience in Mexico, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Mexicans who are on the same page as you and me. They're fed up with it. They don't want it. They've had enough of the cartels, and they've had enough of crappy government. They're natural allies with our people. But I think this talk of sending troops and so forth, we're alienating the wrong people.
Sure.
I guess that's kind of the way I look at it. We do have natural allies in Mexico.
Right.
And I think we need to husband that resource because it's an important one. I think what we need above all first is leadership. We need to see American leaders convinced that this is a problem, and right now we don't. Look at a state like Maryland, which both of us at one time lived in, where if you run for political office in that state and dare to suggest that marijuana should be recriminalized or put the brakes on this effort at legalization, then you're going to be run out of town on a rail in most places. That kind of political obstacle to getting things that need to be done in our country, it's going to have to be overcome. I mean, we're going to have to face it. Until our political leadership is convinced that this is a problem and that we need to address it, we're not going to get anywhere. Instead of treating people like victims or treating them like patients, I think what our nation needs is a boatload of stigma. People need to start hearing that drug users are not patients and they're not victims. They are lawbreakers who cause mayhem in Central and South America. And, believe me, my heart is not made of stone, and I get it. And I understand the disastrous effect of addiction on many families. But that should not blind us to that addiction is financing what can very, very correctly be called terrorism in Mexico and Central America, and to some extent in our own communities. And until we start changing that attitude, I think it's going to be tough.
Are there ways in that strategic concept, or if we go down that road, are there specific concrete things we ought to be trying to do to cut off the money that's already moving?
Well, we've tried so many things already. I mean, with the money laundering requirements that are reflected to an extent now in the Patriot Act, which above all is a Bank Security Act. It's a Bank Secrecy Act, more than anything else. Money laundering regulations from the 80s. We now have restrictions on international wire transfer companies, which of course is another avenue for getting money back to the cartels back home. Most of what we're talking about here is cash. And I think that it would make sense to try to find ways to make it easier to detect these networks. And in my mind, wire transfer is one of them. And to start looking at ways to throwing up obstacles, people who are using these wire transfer companies to send money back. For example, withholding requirements. There's an example. I think only one state in the United States does that, in Oklahoma, where if you're going to use a wire transfer company to send money home or to send money out of the United States, a certain percentage of that has been withheld. But I do believe that, as in most things, what we're really talking about is self-control. We're talking about trying to convince our people that they have a part in this fight, and that by exercising some self-control, whether it be to get therapy for an addiction or what have you, they can make a difference. And Sam, I don't know if you remember the old litter commercial back in the 60s of the Native American man looking at the garbage all over our highways and shedding a tear. I mean, that was a hugely effective public relations campaign. We haven't seen anything like that in decades. Not since Nancy Reagan tried with her Just Say No campaign have we seen anything close.
Right.
We're not doing that. We should do it, and we certainly have the capacity to do it.
Well, Richard, we've run out of time, my friend. You and I probably could talk this issue for hours, but we'll definitely have you back on. I really appreciate you taking the time to address something that's incredibly important.
Thank you for having the show. It's a sleeper issue, which I'm sure your show is going to help bring it to the attention of a lot of our fellow citizens, so I'm grateful to you.
Thank you, and thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on Ground Truth.